Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got on the agenda for today is to add more worms to my newest Red Wiggler worm bin, which is down there on the bottom. It's the taller, darker colored bin. And that bin was launched off only 5 days ago. It's a fairly new bin. And at that time, I was pulling worms out of what I have over here, which is my second oldest Red Wiggler worm bin. And the volunteer worms, or the recruits that I'm enlisting for today's migration of worms, are going to be coming out of this bin right here, which is my oldest bin right now. So my two oldest bins are at the age of 140 days today and 104 days today. So like I said, 5 days ago, when this bin was 99 days of age, we had gone in here and we had taken our first haul of worms out of the bin. The worms had been set up to migrate out of the finished castings over the course of 12 days. And during those 12 days, we had actually added even more food. We let a week go by, added more food, and then when 12 days was reached, we pulled the worms out of there. We launched off the new worm bin, and we even rebuilt the feeding zone because the finished castings still had some worms in it that needed to also be lured out of the finished casting. So we reset the feeding zone, and the process continues in the bin, which is now 104 days of age. The 140-day-old bin was set down that same sequence of events 12 days ago. So it too, 12 days ago, was set up for this horizontal migration process. After a week had passed, we had replenished the feeding zone, make sure there's ample food in there to keep that movement going. And now today, in order to try to mimic what's been happening on the second oldest bin, we're going to do the same exact thing today, which is on day 12, we're going to be pulling the worms out of the horizontal migration feeding zone. We'll reset that feeding zone because I'm assuming we're going to still have a fair number of worms remaining in the castings, and we'll let it continue. And then we're going to take the worms that we've hauled out and place them into my newest bin. So I'm going to get working on this. So why don't you join me? All right, so now here you can see this plastic over here is where that horizontal migration feeding zone had been set up 12 days ago. And like I said earlier, we came in here only 5 days ago to make sure that that feeding zone has plenty of food in it so that it continues to remain nice and tempting, to try to keep convincing all the worms that are hanging out on this side of the bin, which is where the finished castings are, to keep them coming on over here. The plastic was there to try to help maintain recirculation of the moisture that's in there. So all the food that was placed in there, any moisture kicking off that food would probably want to evaporate into the air, and the plastic helps capture that and recirculate the moisture. And that's why you can see a little bit of dampness here on this top covering of paper. And even these relatively dry leaves that were placed on top of the feeding zone, I could feel have a nice bit of moisture to them. Now, I think in the past, I'd been able to reuse these pieces of cardboard, but in this case, it doesn't seem likely. When I did this to the other bin, there was a fair bit of material hanging off here that I had flapped over and covered the feeding area with. And there was enough of it that I was able to use it as sort of a dividing wall here to show me where the finished compost is versus where the feeding zone is. But I got a feeling that this piece of cardboard is just going to become bedding at this point. So I've got myself a, where is it? Here it is. I've got myself this nice, pretty deep tub here. And like I did last week, I'm going to be pulling all the stuff out of here. But I'm going to do it in a way that I can sort of keep things a little bit separated, because what I'd really like to put into here is mainly worms. But I know that a lot of stuff in here is going to be sort of reclaimed material that we could certainly put right back in here to keep this process moving. And in this way, we'd only be moving worms. We could use a lot of this nice mature, nice aged stuff to rebuild the feeding zone at the end. So I mean, as much as I expect to be able to use a lot of this stuff, I've also bought down a bit of fresh food, so-called fresh food from my freezer. So the feeding zone will be a combination of reused materials as well as some fresh food from my freezer. So I'm going to get a different tub that we could put some of this reclaimed material into, because I think we're going to have a fair bit of it. This isn't quite as large as the other tub is, but it's got enough room in it, I believe, to temporarily hold the material that we think would be recyclable. So besides a lot of this leafy matter off the top, if we encounter any really large chunks of food that the worms have not yet completely depleted, it too, I think, will be good stuff that we could reuse for rebuilding the feeding zone. So I've got stuff here already, a banana stem. The peel is probably history by now, but the stem seems to still be here. This is just kind of bedding type materials, cardboard and whatnot. No need to move all that. This is all great stuff that we could use for the rebuild of the feeding area. I'm just trying to see if there's any stuff right here on the top surface that would classify as, good recyclable stuff. But at some point here, I think it's going to be time to simply start scooping. But here too, I'm seeing some larger chunks of cardboard, stuff that doesn't need to necessarily go over to the new bin with the worms. Certainly good stuff that would continue to do a much better job for us right here, as opposed to being moved with the worms. I think a lot of the stuff we're seeing right here on top is coffee. It looks a lot like the finished castings that the worms leave behind, but I did cover this feeding area with coffee. So I'm assuming that that's what most of this is, so we're going to just hang on to that too. But now I think we're probably getting close to the point where we can start scooping out the majority of the feeding area. And once it's in the larger tub, we can actually pick through it a little bit and extract any large chunks that we think are going to be useful for rebuilding the feeding area. So I'm curious to see how many worms we were able to round up in this process. If it's anything like what we got out of the second oldest bin, then we're probably going to have something in the neighborhood of about 1,000 worms. This is where I like to sort of poll the audience to see what people think while we're rummaging through what's been removed. I try to get some feedback on, how many worms do people think we've got here. Here too, if I see large chunks that, would be good candidates for reuse, this seems like a good enough time to scoop it out. I could see that I'm also bringing a certain number of worms along for the ride to go right back into the worm bin, which is fine. I mean, once I put them back into the feeding zone, they will be in the right place. And I doubt that they're going to leave the feeding area to return over into the relatively depleted finished castings. All right, that looks like a nice big handful of wormies. Here too, I'm seeing strips of paper, some good bedding material that we could use to rebuild the feeding zone with. I mean, if some of it goes along for the ride with the worms into their new home, that's fine too. But a lot of times I do like to see if I can pick through the stuff and recycle it if possible. All this stuff has already got a good head start. It's all the type of stuff that the worms really like. It's already partially broken down, so it should really help make the rebuilt feeding area very tempting to continue luring worms out of the finished compost. But I don't want to go bananas here picking through it. I should really limit myself to either, a certain number of scoops or handfuls that I pick out, or maybe just a certain amount of time, and then force myself to continue. But it's chunks like this that I'm really after. It's these large chunks of banana peel that are already nicely broken down, obviously attracting lots of worms, as you can see from all the worms piling on it. That's exactly the sort of stuff that I think is going to really be very useful in the rebuild of the feeding zone. The other nice thing is that's what we're left with in the end down here in the larger tub is almost only worms, giving us a slightly better view of how many worms we managed to extract on this go around. Whoa. Because without all that other stuff around them cluttering the view, we can really better see what kind of a extraction we managed on this go around. Here's another banana stem, a little bit more paper type stuff, a little bit more leafy matter. A lot of this stuff that's a little lower now, I believe, is probably mainly castings. I think it was just the coffee. I think it was just the stuff on the top surface that was coffee. This stuff has more of an appearance that resembles castings. Here's some more nice paper bedding type stuff. So we're definitely coming up with a pretty good sized collection of recycling candidates here, but I'm almost out of space. So maybe I'll have to sort of limit myself on what I try to reuse here. Let's see if I can get the majority of what remains in a last single handful. We might have to do one more skim through that feeding area space to see if we could pull out another handful or so of worms. But if we're not able to get all of them, then that's fine too. It's not a problem. We'll get them on the next go around. That's why we're rebuilding the feeding area, to help keep this process moving. And I had almost, yeah. And you know, that reminds me, now that I think of it, just from having said that, I did actually think to myself that maybe it would make good sense to actually check the finished castings on the off chance that maybe there is no need to do a rebuild of the feeding zone. Who knows? Maybe this is the entirety of all the worms that had been occupying the finished castings, and maybe there's no need to rebuild the feeding zone. Maybe we're actually now, you know, left with a bin full of depopulated worm castings, and maybe the migration is done, and maybe all we need to do is consider what's left in this container is our harvest of finished castings, although chances are that's not going to be the case. So I'm fairly confident that it will be necessary to rebuild the feeding zone and let the process continue to try to help us get the remainder of the worms out of the finished compost. But, you know, when it comes time to do the second haul out of worms, at that point we might actually be, you know, nearing the point where the castings have been, for the most part, depopulated, and maybe we can call it a done deal. But I think usually on this first extraction, we're usually still in a situation where the finished castings in the tub still have a fair number of worms remaining in them that need to be hauled out. So I'm thinking maybe one more skim across the edge here, see what we end up with. At this point, I'm seeing a lot of castings material. At this point, I often feel like I'm actually just scooping stuff out of what had been on this side of the partition, basically. So I think we're now pretty much done with our extraction. I've got myself a ready-built replacement for this cardboard right here, which is kind of nice. I had set it up the other day thinking that I would need it, but like I said, I was able to reuse the cardboard that I'd been using up until then. So So I think we're just not in that same situation right now. That piece of cardboard has certainly been whittled down to almost be useless at this point. But I think it'll come in really handy as bedding. So we could probably include it with our rebuild of the feeding zone as well. So I'm pulling it out. And maybe even use it as a little bit of a brush. So I'll place it over there on the pile of stuff that's been reclaimed and will be recycled. So let me just see if I could brush off what is on the bottom here, so I don't end up making a big huge mess. But before we put things away here, we're just going to go ahead and rebuild this feeding zone really quick. It's pretty good. Last time I had done this, I was finding a lot of stuff sticking to my gloves because it was just so damp and sticky. But it's kind of nice when the majority of this stuff just crumbles right off your glove. All right, let's get this thing rebuilt. So here's this nifty piece of cardboard that I fashioned for this job. It's full of little holes to just, not allow it to become an obstacle to prevent worms from getting through. And the other stuff that I've got here, and I guess my other hope is that even if they gobble up the bottom of it, when we come back in here the next time, there'll be enough of it above the surface that we could recycle for a second use. That's what I did in the other bin. So here on the other side of it, we're going to be able to start plopping in the materials that I had set up here for myself to use in the feeding area. And I even made myself a little cheat sheet so that I can follow the method that I followed 5 days ago, because I think it's going to work well. And I also, sometimes like to run bins sort of in tandem with one another. And since the other bin is the one that I'm trying to run this bin with in tandem, I try to follow very similar processes to be able to use the two bins relative to each other for kind of comparison and contrasting purposes. I guess, this cardboard would just make, decent bedding material here. So I'll just tear it up a little bit and get my clean hand dirty. Usually try to keep my clean hand dirty so I could use it to handle the camera. Let's grab all that recycled material that we had in this tray right here, and you can see there's quite a bit of it. So it's probably going to do a nice job helping us refill our feeding area. And it's a nice mix of all kinds of partially decomposed materials, all kinds of lingering food scraps and bedding, even a fair number of worms that came over, which is just fine. At least they're where I want them to be the next time we come in here to haul worms out. And I've still got some other stuff to plop in here, including a whole bag of different stuff that I pulled out of my refrigerator. I'm going to be pouring that entire bag's contents down here into the feeding zone as well. Even though it's frozen, it's mainly mushrooms, and I don't know why, but the mushrooms really seem to take on a pretty stinky odor, even though they're frozen. So I instead of, always having to enjoy the smell of the stinky mushrooms every time I go in there to add a new banana peel or another little batch of cuttings from the preparation of a meal, I figured it was a good opportunity to just do away with them. And if memory serves me correctly, the mushrooms are also a thing that the worms really seem to enjoy too. So I think it'll also help spur on the ongoing migration of the worms quite nicely as well. So I actually made myself little notes here because there was the paper on the bottom, the recycled stuff, the fresh, quote-unquote, fresh stuff we just dropped in, the mushrooms. On top of that is going to be the coffee. I bought some coffee down, which is always a plentiful item here in my house. So I always put it aside after it's been used and the worms get to eat it. Which seems like it would be such a shame to toss this stuff in the trash if the worms could be eating it, right? And what I'll normally do here to top off with before folding this over, sprinkle in a little bit of leafy matter. All right, that's that. And this bin is ready to go. One thing I want to do, which I kind of hinted at earlier, is check this bin over here. And oh yeah, here's my little cheat sheet. I'm remembering now just from doing this. My little cheat sheet also reminded me that the stuff that I'm scraping off the top to get a better look at what's happening below is also a good candidate to be placed into the feeding area. Stuff that's rich with microbes and bacteria and fungus and all that stuff that's going to really kickstart all of the coffee and the freshly added leafy stuff on the top surface. Not to mention that it is a little bit dry, so putting it over where the moisture is going to be recirculating will help it have a better chance at being broken down a little bit better than if it just sat out here on the top surface. So we're just going to take a quick peek into these finished castings to see how the depopulation of the material is progressing. And as we saw in the other bin 5 days ago, we can probably expect to still have a fair number of worms hanging out in this material, and that was why we rebuilt the feeding area. So I'll usually want to start on the very, very far end, which is where I would expect to see the fewest number of worms, since it is the furthest from where I've been adding the food lately. It's kind of anticipating that the feeding zone is doing its job, and it is luring worms out of the finished compost. So I still see a number of worms hanging out in the material, which is fine. It's to be expected. And as we work our way closer to the feeding area, I believe we'll expect to see a greater number of worms. The other reason I like doing this too is that even though the material at the very bottom is not damp or sticky or muddy or anything like that, as you can see it all crumbles right off my glove, it is definitely more moist than what's at the very surface that's had exposure to the air and has had a chance to continue to air out and dry off. And any of that stuff that's been on the top surface and has had a chance to dry a little bit can be sunken down deep to maybe also absorb some of the lingering moisture in the material, because as we continue to allow this stuff on this side to get even more and more dry as time goes on, that becomes yet another reason why the worms that might still be inhabiting it would start thinking that they might want to find themselves a more damp, a more cozy place to be. And over here at the very edge is where we would probably expect to see the greatest number of worms, but I'll be careful to not displace them too much back into the finished compost. I like where they're at. They're really close to where I want them, which is over in the feeding zone, so let's keep them there. I'm learning. I keep telling myself these things out loud, and then, eventually I start to do it correctly the first time. In the past few times I've done this, I've taken a scoop and put it over there, only to feel like I had to push it back over so as not to distance the worms from where I want them to move over to. So if I till up this stuff, I do so in a way that I try not to move it too far away from the feeding area, because if they've come this far and they're this close already, I'd rather just see them remain there and remain just a hop, skip, and a jump away from where I want them in the end. So yeah, I think things are looking pretty good in here. The material's beautiful, even where I would expect it to be the most damp, which is pretty close to where the plastic was causing the recirculation. I'm still not finding anything that's overly sticky or muddy, so that's really nice. And that's good too, because this is the bin that I had really experienced a lot of excess moisture in. And it was that reason that this bin, even though it is my oldest at this point, is kind of in second place in terms of which of my two oldest bins I think is going to get to the finish line first. Because I just needed a little bit more time to let this stuff air out and get dry and more manageable. And in order to help that along, I had put in a whole bunch of leafy matter a dry leafy matter that I thought would soak up some of the moisture, and it's for that reason this stuff does have a little bit more than usual sticks and stems of all those leaves that I had put in here to try to help sop up the moisture. And it was for that reason too I thought that this bin might take a little bit longer to try to give the worms a chance to break all that stuff down too over time. But this stuff looks really great. So now we're going to put it back up on the shelf, let it continue as it has gone up until now. This cardboard is going to help a little bit with the retention of moisture down within the feeding zone, as is this paper covering. But what does the real majority of the job is this piece of plastic that simply does not allow for any moisture to escape the bin, making that feeding area a really nice, damp, cozy place where the moisture continues to recirculate. Hopefully, you know, attracting the worms over there in search of a nice, cozy, damp place to be. So the only thing that remains now is to release the worms we collected. So let's get that started. Oh, it's so cool. I could like lift this thing with one hand, no problem, because it's so light. At only 5 days old, it's got practically no weight at all. So there was the material with which the bin was originally built, leaves, cardboard, paper, stuff like that, as well as some food. And then more recently, that last haul of worms that were placed in here 5 days ago, which I believe was estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 worms. But other than that, there's really not too much stuff in this bin yet. So let's, you know what? I'll do what I've been doing lately. Instead of trying to evict all these worms off of here, I'll just fold the paper in half so that they're not scared by the light. So I'm always worried that they're going to try to just crawl away and leave the paper, end up on the floor or something, but I believe this way they're going to feel that they're okay in a nice, dark, damp place where they're not going to be in danger. So here's the bin. After only 5 days, I would think that it probably still has some of the food that was placed into it, you know, when I built the bin. But there's also the food that probably came along with the worms last time we placed worms in here 5 days ago. And on top of that, I did make an effort to try to pull food scraps and stuff out of here that were of any decent size, but I would think that a pretty good amount of the coffee that had been commingled with the worms, as well as a bunch of bedding material and food, probably did slip by. So even though this probably is mainly worms, you know, as far as the weight is concerned, it's got some pretty good weight to it. I would have to assume that it's also got a fair bit of food remaining in here too. So I'll typically treat this as not only the addition of worms, but also as sort of a feeding. But I mean, after 5 days, I would think that this bin does not require a feeding yet. But now that we're adding this next batch of worms here, which we're going to try to estimate the amount of. I believe the last go around we estimated 1,000 worms, and you know, if we're lucky, maybe we'll have the same amount this time. So if that is true, we're going to have a 2,000 worm population in here once these are released into here. So like I usually do, I'll ask you to check out what you see here and give me your thoughts on how many worms you think we've managed to collect and release into here. Sometimes I'll weigh the container to get an idea of how many worms we're releasing and equate, you know, 1 pound to approximately 1,000 count of worms. But more recently, I've just been kind of going, I think even last time too, we just kind of went with a sort of a visual guesstimate to try to estimate how many worms are in here. We didn't bother with the scale. So let me just make sure I don't have any little guys stuck to my glove. Here we go. And we'll just give these little guys a little bit of time to get situated in their new home. So I think it's only been about 7 or 8 minutes that we've given these little guys to clear out and take shelter from this bright overhead light. I think I still see a couple here and there, but it's not worth waiting for them anymore. I think we should just get things wrapped up here and give these guys some peace and quiet. So I've got some leaves over here. I had set up a new time lapse and I wanted some different colorful materials to build that with. And this is just some of the leftovers. So I'm going to use this as top covering. Usually I just use the leaves that I've got in my box, and they're always handy. I can always run out to the leaf bag that I've got a collection of leaves in and stock up. But sometimes it's just interesting to grab some of these autumn leaves, since it only happens once a year, and try to dress up the appearance of the bin a little bit. So I figured I would just get rid of all the remainder of these leaves that I bought in here and add them to this bin. And this would definitely count as a feeding at this point. So not only is there a bunch of residual food items coming over with the worms themselves, we're also giving them, you know, leafy matter, which in most cases I would consider as more of a bedding, but it's most certainly food as well. So it also gives the whole bin a little splash of color, makes it look kind of nice, right? Alright, so all I've got left to do here is to get the bin covered back up and give these little guys a break. See, the worms that we removed with the paper are still right where we left them. They're more than content just to stay where they're at if they don't sense anything that's going to potentially endanger their lives, such as light. Believe it or not, they see light as, you know, something that could either, you know, in the form of sunlight at least, dry them out and kill them, or, you know, expose them to a potential predator who might see them because they're out in the open and visible because of the light. So let's give them the darkness they crave. All right, everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too, if you haven't done so already. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.